Namaste. I welcome you all to the second lecture of this two-part lecture series on the idea of the natural moral law. As we have already discussed the nature and characteristics of the natural moral law theory in lecture 1, in the present lecture we will be focusing upon the following themes: the nature of moral consciousness and the data of moral consciousness, the foundation of the moral order, the relationship between moral order and human order, and finally we would discuss existentialist humanism as a counter to the view of the natural moral law. Moral consciousness has been regarded as being the residue of the natural moral law. Most of our experiences, whether explicit or implicit, sharp or vague, externally aroused or absolutely internal, tend to leave a definite imprint on our personality. All these experiences, in a sense, add up to form the personality of each individual human. And we, as humans, are not necessarily aware of what all has so affected us, be it in the past or in the present. For instance, some long forgotten experiences might be affecting your behavior and choices here and now without you being aware at all. Most generally then, one may note that the human person is not always aware of what or who he or she really is, that is, of his or her talents, inclinations, capabilities, dispositions, etc. The awareness of these characteristics is what may be called consciousness. Human consciousness may present itself as an ever-developing, ever-progressing totality, having several evolving aspects. Based on the nature of its formal object, the human consciousness can be differentiated into various kinds, including, for instance, the noetic consciousness, whose formal object is truth, the aesthetic consciousness, whose formal object is beauty, as well as the moral consciousness, whose formal object is moral rectitude or the right thing to do. The idea of moral consciousness as well as the associated conception of moral rectitude can be understood most fully by gaining an awareness of the elements or the data of moral consciousness and moral experience itself. The most immediate datum of moral consciousness or moral experience is that there are certain actions which are good and which one should do, and certain actions which are bad and which one should therefore not do. This simply implies that some actions are allowed or permissible, while some are clearly not permissible at all. This datum corresponds to the scholastic tenet, which is also the first immediately known principle of practical reason, namely, good is to be done and evil is to be avoided. It may be noted that the good and the evil being talked about here are always actualized as certain specific good or evil acts or actions. Now, to distinguish what is purely subjective to each one of us from what can be said to belong objectively to every normal human person, it is required that we constantly take into consideration the experience of other human persons as far as we can gauge, not only from our study of history, but also from our interactions with other people in our everyday contact with them. Insofar as the primary datum of moral consciousness is concerned, it may be noted that nothing is said about how one comes to the awareness of such a distinction, whether by parental influence, education, socialization, observation, etc. Yet, the fact that human persons from time immemorial in all the different cultures have held such a distinction is taken as a proof that it is an ineradicable datum of moral consciousness. Whether this datum is actually subjective or objective, or what the source of this information is in one's life, is something that cannot be determined. Yet, the fact that all people in all cultures recognize this datum as a norm guiding their conduct and actions is something which cannot be denied. Additionally, moral consciousness also comes associated with a sense of an obligation or an absolute should with regard to the good action coming across as something which should be done, as well as the bad action as being something which should be avoided. This obligation is, however, not purely subjective. Rather, it comes with a sense of objectivity attached to it. This is so because this feeling of constraint and obligation is experienced as being applicable not only to me but to every human person. If I understand that such and such an action is an absolute should for me, then I also conceive that it is and must be an absolute should for everyone who understands it the same as I do. In other words, this absolute should imposes itself not only on me but on every human person universally. Remember that we are not saying which particular actions every human person understands to be universally obligatory. Rather, the emphasis is on the assertion that this sense of the universality of the absolute should is given in the moral consciousness as clearly as its objectivity. Another datum of moral consciousness is that what is right should be done because it is right. That is to say, that the right imposes itself on me as its own ultimate end. It comes across as being immediately clear that if I do what is in itself right but out of a bad motive, I am not really doing what is right. Furthermore, even if the motive is not itself a wrong or bad one, still, unless I clearly and reflectively understand that to act in such and such a manner out of such and such a motive is to act rightly, I cannot be said to be really acting rightly either. Hence, no matter how many motives I may have for my action, immediate and mediate, unless my ultimate motive is right and it is known to be right, my action would remain radically vitiated. Finally, even the sense of satisfaction one feels and experiences when one does what one thinks to be right, as well as the sense of guilt we feel when we do what we think to be wrong, may also be counted among the data of moral consciousness immediately known. In the analysis of the nature of the immediate data of moral consciousness, a reference was hardly made to any particular human action, which could be concretely determined as the good or the bad action. Yet, from a more general vantage point, one would find that the actions which are usually judged as being good or bad are those that almost always have to do, either directly or indirectly, with the social relations of humans. The moral or immoral act happens to be recognized within the sphere circumscribed by the social relations of humans. This facet of human interrelatedness gets accommodated within the idea of the human person too. What is meant by the idea of personhood here is the essential nature of the relation that humans have with other humans, despite being individual agents themselves. This relation to other men forms an integral part of the very essence of each person, that is, of his nature as a human being. It is this social dimension and essential interrelatedness of the human person which gets understood as the human order. And further still, it is this interrelatedness itself which acts as the immediate ontological foundation of the moral order. This position corresponds to the scholastic view, which tells us that the immediate ontological foundation of morality is human nature adequately considered, that is, considered in the totality of its relationships. The main question which lies at the center of the natural moral law view is, does each human being, as a matter of fact and as a matter of right, create his or her own moral values? That is, does each individual idealize for themselves what their own moral behavior should be? Or do they, in fact and by right, do so on the basis of some given reality? In other words, what is being asked here is whether there is some reality which serves as the basis or foundation for the human person's moral values and moral behavior. If we look at these questions closely, we would find that they contain within themselves several underlying issues. The first one concerns the question of fact, that is, whether there is in fact such a foundation, whether human person in fact consciously or unconsciously build their moral values on it. The second issue concerns the question of right or normativity, that is, whether there should be such a reality, whether human persons should build their moral values on it. Apart from these implicit questions, other questions can be, if there is such a foundation, is it the same foundation for all men at all times? Even if human persons were to build their moral values on this foundation, how would they know that such and such is a moral value in the first place? Our study of human person may lead us to think that there is, at least in fact, no such real or objective foundation for moral values. Human persons have since always been creating their own moral values. What one could say, however, is that the moral values of individuals tend to be conditioned by several factors, including the mentality of the group they live in, the contemporary social mores and customs, by their religious culture, etc. For instance, the ideal human behavior of a human person belonging to a headhunting tribe is to kill as many of his enemies as possible, and thus to collect as many skulls as possible. Despite the obvious divergences of moral values across individuals and cultural groups, it is still argued that this variability of moral values may be resting on the same objective foundation. Experience gives us ample instances which indicate that even two diametrically opposed moral actions, one which we consider good and the other bad, could in fact be guided by the same motive. For example, imagine someone who, out of his love for his terminally ill mother, not only wants to minimize her discomfort, but at the same time wishes to prolong her life as much as possible. Imagine again someone who, out of a similar feeling of love and care for his mother, tends to be motivated to allow the doctors to administer a lethal dose to end her painful ordeal. Keeping in view these examples, it may be asked, if the same motive, which is a subjective intention, serves as the basis of absolutely different human actions, then can there be an objective reality which does in fact serve as a basis or foundation for moral values irrespective of their divergence and variability? Jean-Paul Sartre has given a concrete expression to a specific way of thinking with regard to the questions raised here. And as is the case with several moral philosophers, his moral stance also tends to derive from and depend upon his ontological views. For Sartre, there neither is nor can there be an objective foundation of moral values. He insists that an objective foundation would necessarily be dependent upon a realism of essences created by God. However, for Sartre, the very notion of God seems contradictory. He argued that if God existed, he would have to be both and at the same time and in itself and a for itself, thereby taking the non-existence of God for granted. Sartre tries to draw several possible conclusions from a logically coherent atheism. If there are no pre-existing essences on which to build a moral order and no pre-existing norms according to which human person can pass moral judgment, then they are free and left on their own to create their own moral values. In insisting upon this standpoint, it is not that Sartre does not acknowledge a certain universal form of ethics, which permits us to pass both a logical and moral judgment on ourselves and on others. Rather, for Sartre, this universal form of ethics tends to be based on human freedom itself. Sartre explains that just like the artist who has no pre-existing norms to tell him what and how to create aesthetic value, human persons too are required to invent their own moral values. What therefore seems to be of utmost significance for Sartre is the element of invention and the knowledge of whether or not the invention has been done in the name of freedom. Having no God to obey, no ready-made rules of conduct to go by, and indeed condemned to be free, the human person finds himself alone, jettisoned in the world of useless passion and absurdity. But it is precisely this anguish which is at the root of that existential despair when the individual comes to choose freedom for himself and for others as well. For Sartre, his existentialism is indeed humanistic in the sense that it promotes the dignity of the human person, which consists precisely in being a free individual. Human person as a conscious being, insofar as he is free, is different from a thing. A thing, which Sartre calls the en soi or in itself, is static, fixed, opaque to itself, determined and therefore definable. Whereas the human person, the por soi or for itself, is dynamic, always in the making, transparent, undetermined and therefore indefinable. If human persons had their essence already prefabricated, then they would end up as things and their human dignity would be done away with. But their essence is what they themselves make of their existence in freedom. That is why for Sartre, existence precedes his essence. In addition, the human person also stands to be responsible towards others as well. For when he or she acknowledges and chooses freedom, he or she is by that very fact also acknowledging and choosing freedom for others too. Thus, it becomes clear that Sartre does subscribe to a certain universal form of ethics which is based on human freedom. Yet, Sartre refuses to determine for the human person what his moral values and hence the moral order are or should be. These are left to each human person's invention provided he invents in freedom. Human freedom, therefore, becomes the very foundation of the moral order for which we are seeking. Sartre's moral stance, if critically analyzed from the perspective of its possible practical consequences, seems to end up in moral anarchy, something which even Sartre would not wish to subscribe to. While it is true that the common usage of the phrase nature of human person or of human person's essence connotes a definite sense of staticity and definiteness, and what Sartre tries to insist upon is human person's dynamism. Yet, Sartre's refusal to define the human person in terms of what he or she shares with all other humans reflects a philosophically untenable nominalism. This analysis exposes how an emphasis on one polarity of reality, if left unchecked and unbalanced by an equal emphasis on its opposite polarity, leads to logical absurdities. What is, however, a precious insight seems to be the fact that moral values are most undeniably based and founded upon the human persons themselves.